Hello, and thank you for tuning into Distilling Paul. This is a conversation that's an intergenerational conversation about a timeless leader, the Apostle Paul. I have with me Dr. John Lillis, and I am Pastor Tim Sprankle, and we are here for our second conversation about the Apostle Paul. If you missed the first one, we talked about the allure of Paul, and John shared a 30-year journey studying the Apostle Paul, his life and ministry, and talked about how the Apostle Paul has helped shape him in his personal devotional life, shaped him in his mission work, and shaped him as a teacher. And so that was a great conversation we were able to have last month. And today we're going to talk about the challenge of Paul. Anyone who has read the epistles understands that Paul doesn't always hold back his punches. His theology, his wording, his life, his ministry is really challenging. It stretches us. And that's what we're going to look at today. Before I start asking John some questions, what I'm going to do is just share real briefly. John, you probably don't know this story, but it was the Apostle Paul who almost kept me out of full-time ministry. I was a student at Grace College. It was my freshman year, and I was at the school to study biblical studies and youth ministry, and I had a crisis of faith. This wasn't in my classes. It was for my own personal devotional reading, but I was reading through some of Paul's letters. And some of the language that he uses when he talks to his readers about how he prays for them without ceasing. Every time they come to mind, he prays for them. He talks in terms of his love for them like a father and like a mother. I mean, just so endearing to these people. And some of them he spent years with, and some of them he was with them for 2 weeks, but he just had this overwhelming love and passion for them. So I'm reading this, and then I'm looking in the mirror thinking, I don't know that I love anybody except myself. I certainly don't pray for anybody the way that the Apostle Paul prays without ceasing or every time you come to mind. And I'm over halfway through my first year of Bible college studying to be a pastor, and I think, I can't do this. There is nothing in me that is like the Apostle Paul, at least the way that he writes to these people. And I was having a crisis of faith. So that was my moment with Paul, where I was like, this man is stretching me. I can't do ministry because I'm nothing like him. And fortunately, over time, through experience, God has used not only the Apostle Paul, but my wife and people in my church and lots of difficult experiences to really grow that love, passion, and sense of prayer for his people. I'm getting closer to the ideal, but I have been stretched by the Apostle Paul. And I want to hear from you today and learn from you. How have you been stretched by this man, by his life and by his letters? And so my first question for you, John, is describe for us how you understand the personality of Paul.
Well, let me begin by saying that's a difficult task. Because Paul, as you look at him from a third-party description in the book of Acts, but then as you look at him as he surfaces through his epistles, is a man of contradictions, at least as we catch those glimpses. And what we know about Paul, we know basically through those two sources, his epistles and through the book of Acts. Let me just give some bullet points there. First of all, I think he was a man of deep conviction. And you see that even before he was a believer. As a Hebrew, he described himself later as a Hebrew of the Hebrews. When he was in, he was all in. And he persecuted the church with fervor and zeal because of his deep convictions, his deep commitments as to what was the truth of Judaism and how this was a false cult, to use contemporary language, this Christian thing. But then after his conversion, after his Damascus Road experience, Paul devotes his entire life to preaching the gospel of Christ. And again, you see when he gives self-testimony in his epistles, he's not only in, he's all in. And it's one of the things, going back to last week, that draws me to Paul.
Hmm.
I just wish, well, kind of going to your testimony there, that I could be as committed, as in love with the Lord Jesus Christ as Paul evidently was. His whole life was centered on Christ. So he was a man of deep convictions. I think he was a driven person also. Maybe in current, well, not so current anymore, but there was a time when we talked about type A personalities. And I think Paul might have been a type A personality, but he was driven, and he focused on accomplishing a well-defined and deeply understood calling and mission. And I jotted down Colossians 1:28. He says, "We proclaim him, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we may present every man complete in Christ." And that kind of sums up Paul's life, his ministry, his mission, his convictions, his commitments. So, I mean, he was driven to accomplish that personal mission and that calling, as it were. And then he was a very direct person. And this might be where some of the tension comes in. But he was direct with regard to the truth. Paul was not afraid to speak forcefully, truth and correction where that was needed. And we see that in Acts. And then we see it in the epistles, especially as he's dealing with churches or people in churches that were, some, you might want to say disagreeing with him, but it's not disagreeing with Paul's personal thoughts. It's disagreeing with what Paul knew to be the truth about the gospel. So, and then another point, a fourth point here would be that he was uncompromising. He was a man of deep conviction. He was driven. He was direct, and he was uncompromising. That struck me throughout my years, and again, it's just a part of what I wish I was, because sometimes in my desire to keep the peace, not to be a peacemaker, but to keep the peace, I sometimes find myself compromising more than I think I really ought to. And so when you look at those characteristics, deep conviction, driven, focused on mission, direct person, uncompromising, I think that made him a strong and effectual leader. And I think you need to see that in light of who he was as a young Pharisee as well as a Christian. Because as a young Pharisee, he was already being recognized as a man of substance, a man of importance, a man of impact. At Stephen's stoning, the fact that he was there, not participating in the stoning, but guarding the cloaks or whatever, it implies kind of a supervisory role there. They laid their cloaks at his feet, Acts tells us, and he was consenting unto his death. So even as a young Pharisee, he had some positions of responsibility. He was recognized there as well. So there was some natural leadership. And I think he also demonstrated that natural leadership later after Stephen's death by pressing the persecution of the church. I mean, Paul, as part of his convictions, as part of his drivenness, was one of those at the forefront we see in pressing the persecution. But then after his conversion, he becomes the key leader, I think, for the advance of the gospel in the first century. He was recognized as such by his own circle of followers, as well as others in the early church and later. Um, there's the council at Jerusalem where he was recognized enough, and his ministry was becoming broad enough, where he's called back to give some explanation. Um, and then later in Galatians 2, he talks about his interaction with some of the leaders of the church. And Peter, in his epistles, talks about Paul's writings. So he was recognized as a leader. And he was also recognized as such by those outside the church, by those who attacked the church, both the Jews and the Gentiles. So to me, there's, just kind of a basic outline of Paul's personality. In terms of who he was as a human, in terms of who he was as a person, in terms of who he was in the flesh, let's say, all of the patterns and constructs of his mind, his being before Christ. But then there was a significant change on that road to Damascus. There, God began the humbling, I think, and that's a huge thing. The humbling of this up and coming proud Pharisee. He's blinded, and that vision turned everything around that he had thought about the Messiah. For him, the Messiah was still future, still coming, and turned everything around and basically turned everything on its head. And not only about the Messiah, but about this fellow Jesus that he had been persecuting their followers. Excuse me. And then I think the humbling continues when he finds out he's got to be taught initially by one of those he was coming to persecute. Now, again, think about who this Paul was. This was this proud, I would say almost probably arrogant Pharisee in terms of his knowledge, the equivalent, first century equivalent of probably a PhD in Old Testament studies under Gamaliel. And then he finds out, okay, the Messiah has come. It is this Jesus. He has this vision. And now the first thing you've got to do is go and be taught by this fellow you are coming to persecute, this fellow who doesn't probably have all of the study and the learning in the law that you had. And then later, the humbling continues, and we're not sure what this was, but by his thorn in the flesh. He mentions that as well. So God took those natural tools, who Paul was in the flesh, as a platform for the gifting that he got then, the spiritual gifting. But to make it effectual in the kingdom, there had to be humbling. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. We all have natural abilities. We all have natural gifts that can become platforms. But I think for all of us, there has to be a humbling in terms of how that's worked out.
Yeah, I think if I could just interject here.
Please do.
I think that's a great insight because as you were going through the Apostle Paul prior to his conversion and then after his conversion, there are elements of his personality or personal life that don't change. They get redeemed, they get used in a different way. And so his drivenness becomes wholly ambition rather than just like this desire to tyrannize the church. So God doesn't change his personality there, but he uses it in redemptive ways, but that need to be humbled over and over and over again. And you wonder if that's part of what Paul reflects on in his testimony a few times when he says in Ephesians, I was the least of the saints, or in 1 Corinthians 15, I'm the least of the apostles, or lastly me, 1 Timothy 1, the least of the apostles. He's picking up on that or reflecting out loud, like God had to humble me. God had to
Right.
humble me, which nobody wants to be humbled, but
No.
it's something God brings our way to make us more like Christ, more like he wants us to become. So yeah, that's a great insight.
No, and I appreciate the way you've built on that. There's some thoughts I haven't thought yet, so I appreciate that. Um,
Do you want to, this is off script. I didn't send you this ahead of time, but do you want to share publicly what your guess of the thorn in the flesh was?
um, I guess if, just off script, I have, and not having thought about it, I kind of lean towards the eyes, something to do with his eyes. Um, but gosh, I don't know. It might have been one of his followers. Who knows?
Sure.
The sheep have teeth often.
Yes.
So, um, well, and this is where the contradictions come in. Although he was direct, although he was forceful, although he was driven, although he was a very effectual leader because of all that, Paul was also a man of deep compassion, care, and love for the churches. Um, and you and I have talked about this outside this recording, but he expresses his love for the churches um, as the love of a mother for her children. And I remember the first time I read that, and kind of like you, I didn't quite go to a crisis of faith. I was already out of seminary and studying Paul, and I thought, wow, um, I'm not sure that. Well, no, I am sure. I am sure that I don't feel that way always. Maybe very seldom towards the people with whom or to whom I'm ministering. Um, because sometimes the sheep do have teeth and it's hard to love them. But uh, I guess so that's part of loving as a mother as well, because children aren't always, oh, golly, mother, that's just wonderful, are they?
I was
Um,
not always that way to my mother. I will admit that right now.
so, I mean, we see that over and over in his epistles, and that's something that struck me. He expresses his deep and abiding love for the various churches. Um, so there's that love. I also think Paul, and this is just me reading between the lines, I think he was prone to depression,
Hmm.
especially when he was deprived of fellowship with his friends when imprisoned. Now, I'm not willing to die for that, but I think you see that sometimes in his writings that he missed his friends when he was in prison. But at the same time, he could express great joy and victory in Christ in the aftermath of severe trials and disappointments. And you see that in the Corinthian epistles when he talks about the persecution that he had undergone. And that always, I think it's Second Corinthians, if I'm remembering correctly. It's always kind of bubbling there. I've had a tough time of late. But he still is willing to express that joy and victory in Christ.
Positive psychologists would call that term grit or resiliency, and they talk about post-traumatic growth. But you have to go through the trauma to experience that post-traumatic growth, and I think that's today's language to describe what you're saying of Paul there.
Right. Um, Not believing in psychology. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, that's, I was going to say quick. I guess it's relatively quick. There's whole books written on the personality of Paul. It's interesting when you begin to study that a bit, or articles, maybe not books, but articles of people trying to get to the personality of Paul. And some are descriptive, some attempt to be psychological, but he's a complex character. He's a very complex character, and there are apparent contradictions as we look in from the outside. But I don't think he was that self-contradictory.
Yeah, I think that's good to put that whole portrait together too, because if we just look at Paul as the driven leader, we can focus on one aspect of it. If we just narrow our focus to a few of his affectionate phrases from the epistles, we can paint him as this grandfatherly figure. And he was, like all of us, a complex blend of ups and downs and passions and emotions and dreams and disappointments. I mean, that's how he comes. And we're actually really blessed that we have Acts that kind of chronicles his personal story from Luke's perspective, but then his letters where he can give biographical detail, which, by the way, we know from Acts that he gives some biographical detail too. And those testimonials that he gives in Acts 22 and 26, he's
Right.
sharing his story. And you're right to point out how climatic that moment was for him, that conversion experience. He comes back to it again and again and again. It was just the beginning of the humbling. But I like how you point out that maybe there was this proneness to depression in his life. You can be driven, you can be committed, you can be loving, and you can still have some inner turmoil that you're going through. And that's not a slam on your personal spiritual growth. Paul was like the rest of us that way, where he had some of those emotional struggles. But you're right. Ancient biography is different than modern biography. And we don't even have an ancient biography of Paul. We have traces in his letters and traces in Acts. So what we do is our best job of piecing those things together, synthesizing them and reflecting on them. And so I do have some more questions that I'd like to ask, but I think that's great to lay out a sort of what it was his personality. How do we understand him as a person in his life story? How do you think his personality, ministry style, and his tone that you read in his letters, but also see in Acts, created some tensions? And could you give some personal examples of that?
By personal examples, you mean?
Specific examples, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I know you haven't talked with Paul recently. At least I don't think you have. Hey, Paul.
Well, let me take some of those characteristics that I said. You know, the fact that he was a man of conviction, that he was driven, that he was mission focused. I think the prime example that everybody goes to with the tension is the conflict he had with Barnabas over John Mark in Acts 15. You know, they had a mission to perform. They had to get out there and get it done. And evidently there was some things where John Mark wasn't as committed in Paul's eyes, wasn't as mission focused. And so that created some tension, and they went separate ways for a bit. Now that was ultimately healed, and John Mark became valuable to him later in his ministry. The fact that he was uncompromising, he confronted Peter over giving into the Judaizers when he stopped eating with the Gentiles in Galatians, or it's recorded in Galatians. When he's writing the Galatians, he talks about how he had to confront Peter over that. And I mean, again, this is to me evidence of the significance of Paul being viewed as a leader in the church. I mean, Peter was the leader after Christ's ascension, and Paul confronted him and said, you know, you're missing the point of the gospel here, basically. And then several times, but in particular in his dealings with the Corinthians, his uncompromising commitment to the purity of the gospel. They were trying to mix in some of the factors, well, several factors. I mean, there's just personal impurity, but there were some theological things that they were bringing in from the mystery religions. Their whole concept of the word that we translate perfection, maturity, it's a Greek word Telios, and that word shows up in the mystery religions, and it had to do with you were Telios if you had a particular body of knowledge. And so Paul addresses that in 1 Corinthians especially, and says, you know, you've got to stick with what is the gospel that I brought to you. And some of you think you're Telios, and you're anything but Telios. I've had to treat you as babies, which was kind of sticking the knife in and then twisting it, because they were claiming to be the Telios, the mature, the perfect. So there was, some examples, but I want to kind of qualify that by saying tension isn't always a bad thing. There's there are times when there should be tension, and I think I'm not sure about we don't have the details on Barnabas and John Mark, but these other things, I'm sure that created some tension with Peter and the Jewish believers when Paul confronted them. And we know for a fact with the Corinthian correspondence that there was not a little tension between Paul and the church at Corinth. But that church needed fixing, as it were, needed straightening out. So tension's not a bad thing. And I think Paul sometimes gets a bum rap because people tend to look at, the Barnabas and John Mark thing, and that becomes Paul's total personality. That's the prime example of who Paul was. Paul was, he not only loved the churches and loved his friends and was loyal to them, but in return, they loved him and were loyal to him. So I think maybe in summing that up, we need to be careful of a simplistic, negative perspective of Paul, of his personality, because of the John Mark incident. We don't know the details there.
And let me even say this, that if you look at 2 Peter and take that as a letter that Peter wrote, he cites Paul at the end of that and says, his letters, like the other scriptures, they're difficult to understand, but he equates what Paul's writing with the Old Testament scriptures and gives a real endorsement of the Apostle Paul. That would have been written after the incident when they talk about table fellowship. And so maybe Peter licked his wounds a little bit. Peter seems like, if we're talking about personalities of people in the scriptures, Peter struck me as kind of an impulsive person from the gospel stories. Maybe he could have held a grudge, but he reveres Paul in a sense. And so I think that's also a tribute to the Apostle Paul. And I'd say that, what you're saying too overlooks even a story like when Paul goes to meet with the Ephesian elders and
Yes.
give the last farewell to them. And you read this and everybody's crying and they're hugging. And that's not your first picture of Paul when people talk about the Apostle Paul. Or even, the other thing as you were talking that came to mind is, I think this may have been with the Corinthian letters, the 2 Corinthians, where he says, I'm accused of being bold in my letters, but weak in person. And that claim that he's one guy behind the pulpit and another guy when he's just chatting with you. And that actually shows the complexity of Paul too, that sometimes he can take on a slightly different tone depending on the context and depending on the content of what they're talking about. So let's make a case that the Apostle Paul was a rather complex person. And what we have in our New Testament begs us to look at him as a profound leader, but not just someone who's going to bowl you down, someone who's actually going to come up close next to you and cry with you if you need that. I mean, very, very complex person. Well, I'll tell you what, John, we're going to wrap up this conversation, but this conversation is going to have a part 2 here. And so we do want people to tune in to Distilling Paul. These are conversations between an older guy and a younger guy about a timeless leader, the Apostle Paul. So thank you for being part of this first discussion about how Paul stretches us. I do hope you tune in to the next one. It's part 2 of this, where we're going to look at maybe some themes that the Apostle Paul shared, and personally how some of those themes and writings of Paul have stretched John Lillis. So thanks for being part of this conversation.